The history of polygons in the arcade is a long and storied tale. It goes all the way back to the early 1980s with Atari's iRobot, a multi-directional shooter that didn't play all that well. It was the very first arcade game to use polygons as we know them today. But even before then, we had vector-based visuals creating our 3D worlds in titles like Tempest. Over the course of the next decade, different styles of software took stabs at using flat-shaded polygons to varying results. You got driving games, on-rail shooters, and even flight simulators from both Atari and Namco. Notably absent was Sega, who had spent the entirety of the 1980s and early 1990s mostly perfecting their sprite scaling technologies. But in 1992, Namco's strides with polygon rendering finally started to make Sega sweat. Titles like Starblade were fast, smooth, and presented a game world that was fully relatable. This started Sega on a journey to create a polygon-based board to call their own, which came to fruition in the form of the CG board, or Model 1 as it's more commonly known. The first title created for this technology was Virtua Racing, an absolute stunner in 1992. It redefined what everyone thought was possible with the technology, and Sega was ready to seize on the opportunity to do even more. With 1993 coming into focus, Sega's AM2 division readied a one-on-one fighting game to rule them all. In this episode, we will be looking at Virtua Fighter and how it fared when it came home. Did any of these ports do it justice, or are we still waiting for Sega to give us something worthy of the original? Before we look at the home versions, let's go ahead and spend some time getting to know the original arcade release. This came out in 1993, following the massive success of Virtua Racing. Development for Virtua Fighter had started immediately after that game's release, with Sega AM2 wanting to make a fighting game that anyone could play. They had wanted a simple interface of just 3 buttons, and grounded the various martial arts in reality to avoid complex movements for things like projectiles that had dominated the mechanics in many two-dimensional offerings in the genre. 1 block button, 1 punch button, and 1 kick button is all you get. While this may lead you to believe that Virtua Fighter is a shallow experience, nothing could be further from the truth. Every fighter has dozens of moves and combos at their disposal, and all of them play radically different from one another. It doesn't really take more than a 1-2 combo to have success against the AI, but if you want to do well against other players, you're gonna have to learn technique, move sets, strategies, and the ins and outs of this game's massive depth. Of course, like most video games, even being grounded in reality doesn't mean there aren't any fantastical elements at play. These guys and gals can jump and flip 15 feet into the air, and the gravity feels much lower than most other one-on-one fighters. Of course, the visuals were a huge part of this game's appeal in 1993. The polygons ran so smooth, and the motion captured animation looked phenomenal. It was incredibly well received upon its release, particularly in Japan. Sega sold tons of these arcade units worldwide, and the gaming press lavished it with praise. In hindsight, it's considered one of the most influential releases of that era. Pretty much every game designer that followed its release will tell you that this one title had a huge impact on the hardware and software they made. The first home version landed in November of 1994 for Sega's 32-bit console, the Saturn. It was a launch title in Japan and sold at a nearly 1-to-1 ratio with the hardware. The port was, in a word, rushed. While the Japanese media was kind to the conversion, there was no question Sega cut corners to make the Saturn's launch. There are polygon glitching and dropouts during the replays. The frame rate is more erratic and there is far less geometry being rendered in every scene. Side by side, it's clear the arcade is a vastly superior experience visually. So compromised was the Saturn effort, there is literally polygon draw-in on the ring itself. The rushed nature of the project also meant Sega added nothing extra to the home version. You have the arcade mode, a versus option, and that's it. This is as bare bones as it comes as far as content. But for all the bitching and moaning this game receives, it still played great. All the moves were here and the actual gameplay mechanics felt spot on. I played this for months on end and regret none of the time I invested in it. It had its compromises, but it was still an excellent playing fighter with tons to learn and experience. But for all the fun this game was capable of being, it was quickly surpassed by textured mapped fighters released at the same time. The gameplay held up, but visually the newer fighters blew it out of the water. And when it comes to new hardware, graphics are often a major point of interest, and Virtua Fighter's time in the light was brief and quickly passed. While the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter was doing well in Japan, Western media outlets were questioning Sega's wisdom releasing it against the better-looking fighters from its competitors. Sega seemed to be thinking the same thing, because out of nowhere came Virtua Fighter Remix in June of 1995, just 7 months after the release of the original. This was Sega's answer to the criticism that their new Saturn console was underpowered and the original port had been rushed to market. Sega's AM1 had taken the original AM2 effort, fixed most of the glitches and performance issues, and then added textured maps to all the polygons. They also implemented VDP2 to handle the ring, freeing up power to other areas. The results were actually quite compelling, because this is a vastly superior product in terms of polish. No doubt many of you will still prefer the original flat shaded style, but I still love this for what it was. It was half the price of a typical release in its Japanese launch, and Sega actually gave it away for free in a number of Western regions. It didn't help the Saturn earn any new customers in the US or Europe, but I appreciated it all the same.
2, ready, go!
When Virtua Fighter landed on the 32X, it was nearly a year after the Saturn release in October of 1995. This was developed by the same group that had done Virtua Racing for the Genesis. Sega had believed that this conversion would help boost sales of the underperforming device, but they were about as wrong as could be. By this point, not only was Toshinden out worldwide and selling like hotcakes, but both Tekken and Virtua Fighter 2 were right around the corner. Absolutely no one wanted to see a flat-shaded polygon fighter at this point, particularly one that looked like this. For what it's worth, it was an impressive showing for the 32X. Most of the polygon glitches that marred the original Saturn release were gone, and it didn't suffer the geometry draw-in on the ring. It also played really well, retaining all the fighters and moves from the arcade. Sega also added a tournament mode, new camera angles, a new match replay system, and you could customize your fighter's colors. For what it is, it was easily one of the better games on the 32X, and certainly showed a promise that the device could have done so much more than the upgraded Genesis titles we got. But we can sugarcoat this all kinds of different ways. The truth still remains that it was a massive downgrade in audio and visuals from even the Saturn release, which was already compromised from the arcade edition. The 32X version rendered far less polygons that were jaggier and nowhere near as defined. The shadows are downgraded and the backgrounds have less color. The sound quality also took a hit, both in the music and sound effects. What was a solid showing on the 32X still did not translate to a product that showed well next to the software hitting the other 32-bit consoles at the time. It was a winner for those that already owned the hardware, but Sega needed something a lot more than this to get new people interested in its 32X.
2, ready, go!
After the 32X release, the original Virtua Fighter disappeared from Sega's lineup completely. It wasn't brought back for the Dreamcast, and before you knew it, the Virtua Fighter series seemed to be forgotten by Sega. That was until 2003, when Virtua Fighter 10th Anniversary made its way to the PlayStation 2. I was so excited to see this at first. I thought this was a high-res remake of the arcade original, but it's really not. It's actually a 10th anniversary celebration that reskins Virtua Fighter 4 into a flat-shaded homage to the original. The gameplay here keeps a few of Virtua Fighter staples like the floaty jumps, but the core gameplay is Virtua Fighter 4 minus a few moves. I eventually came to love this version for its throwback qualities, but I still admit I was hoping for an actual port of the arcade original. For those of you curious, Virtua Fighter 5 also had some DLC called the Legendary Pack that reskinned that game as well. After Sega celebrated the 10th anniversary on the PlayStation 2, Virtua Fighter once again slips into retirement. It made no appearances in any of the Sega Ages collections and has not seen any more console ports as of this video. It did get included in the standalone Astro City Mini device that Sega released in late 2020. Here it was, for all intents and purposes, the very first time we would get an arcade-perfect version of this at home. Well, at least when you played it on the device itself. It did have some performance hiccups when you ran the 720p HDMI output to a television, but other than that, it was a winner. It was so great to finally see this as an official release, and it looked just as it did all those years ago. I wanted to do this video not just to cover the Virtua Fighter releases that we did receive, but also to express my disappointment in what we didn't get. How did we miss a perfect Virtua Fighter edition to the Switch's Sega Ages line? How has there not been a Virtua Fighter collection for home consoles? I mean, we are legitimately talking one of the most influential titles to the modern era of 3D gaming, and in order to play it, you need consoles that are over 20 years old. And even then, the ports weren't even close. It's really quite amazing how far modern Sega has pushed the Virtua Fighter series away from the limelight. It's true they are putting some time into Virtua Fighter 5 again, but how about a collection of the first 4 games, arcade perfect, to show the world what the series meant to gaming all those years ago? And on that note, it's even more crazy that to date, we still have never seen a perfect port of Virtua Fighter 3 or Virtua Fighter 4. While the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 did admirable jobs with their available hardware, the arcade versions of both these titles were superior, and I'd love to see them get a modern uptick in resolution on the machines available today. Come on, Sega, you are sitting on a killer fighting series here that inspired and influenced damn near every fighting game you see today. To let them languish in obscurity is unbelievably depressing. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.